This is Underdog Portfolio Weekly, hosted by Scott Conn.
What is good, DD family? We're back with another UPW live Best Ball Mania draft. This is 9.0, and we are about to go live here in just a second. I got Eric Beimfohr, the creator of Spike Week. It has been a lifesaver for Ray and I this year as we have gone from basically, well, me, zero to as many underdog drafts as possible. And I know he's found it very useful. But Eric, welcome. I think we are in the same draft. I am in the 7 spot. You are in the 9 spot. And I recognize at least 2 people from the community / chat in this draft. So this should be fun. And welcome, my friend. Good having you on finally.
Yeah, appreciate it. I know a shout out to you guys. Anybody that is using and loving the Spike Week tools is phenomenal, but it's fun to see other, like you said, especially you coming from maybe not doing as many drafts and then really diving into Bestball, seeing like the tools and the power it can unlock in how helpful that they can be from you have all this knowledge in your brain and you have all these things that you want to put into practice in your drafts, and everything that we try to do with everything at Spike Week, the tool that maybe you'll see today on the draft in the draft hacker. But everything is really about like helping people be better drafters with all the knowledge and everything that people like you are presenting to people. So it's awesome to see, and I'm super pumped to hang out and do a draft with you. Yeah,
I'm looking forward to it. So I'm in the 9 spot. Or no, I am in the 7 spot. You are in the 9 spot. So let me go ahead and get the draft board share here. I see Dr. B. Harris. He always drafts with us on Wednesday nights. He is in the 5 spot. So let's just talk through strategies from this spot. I know this has been covered ad nauseum. Honestly, you are in I like to call it probably the worst or best spot, depending on how you want to start your draft. But I do not love... I'd rather be on the turn than in the 9 or 10 spot personally. Yeah. But what are your thoughts with where you're at?
Yeah, I think that for me personally, depending upon how you feel about, Breece Hall, Bijan Robinson, etc., there's kind of some form of a tier break around our picks. Your 7 spot, my 9 spot, there's somewhere in there. It gets really wide open. And so I'm doing a ton of, you mentioned the tools and stuff that we have at Spike Week. I'm doing a ton of massaging how I combine those players from like pick 7 to pick 20. Like it feels pretty wide open. I'm not saying that the guy at pick 20 is the same as the guy at pick 7, but I am saying that I don't want to just lock in on ADP at every single one of these spots, because I don't really think there's a huge difference between Nico Collins and Marvin Harrison. But there's a huge difference between who Marvin Harrison gets drafted with and who Nico Collins gets drafted with. And so that's a lot of what I'm doing. I might do it here in this draft. I will say my favorite player, in the back half, it is probably still Puka Nacua. Puka or Garrett Wilson are just guys that I could see not necessarily like being the wide receiver 1 or anything like that, and I'm going to take Garrett Wilson. But just the kind of combination of floor and ceiling that those guys bring you is so powerful. And what I really like about the early rounds and what I really like about early round wide receivers is don't screw this up for me. I would like for this team to just keep on chugging along, even if you're not matching CeeDee Lamb, you're not matching Tyreek Hill or whatever. Just don't be the reason that this team finishes 10th, And so those wide receivers have their upside cases, but they also have the high floor that is really powerful in best ball, more powerful in best ball probably even than like any other format, where I just gotta contend, during the regular season, just contend and have your huge games at the right time. And clearly those guys have the potential to have that huge game. And so I really like some of those options, and then mixing and matching them with, like I said, Nico Collins, Olave, the Niners guys in the 2nd round, Marvin Harrison, mixing and matching them with those guys is a lot of my strategy right now in the back half of the 1st round.
Yeah, it's funny. I was looking at my ownership across just BBM5, and I think this is my 74th BBM5 draft, so I still am about halfway home. But outside of CeeDee Lamb and Christian McCaffrey, who largely you have to get the 1 or 2 spot to get, I'm between like 10 and 13% on everybody else. So there really isn't a differentiation, in my opinion, when you're going from like pick 3 to 14. You're probably going to have kind of balanced ownership of all of those players in there, unless you are just like, what would you say to somebody that pulled this up and they've just haphazardly drafted 50 teams, but they're at 23% AJ Brown and 4% Garrett Wilson? Like there's a bias there that I think, now you can have your conviction, but I think that bias early in drafts is a little bit too wide, whereas it really starts to stray. We'll talk about that here in a second, because I can look obviously with Spike, we can kind of figure out, do I have any combinations of these players? And I really don't want to see what I want to do here on the clock. God, this is so gross.
while you're doing that, it's funny because I think the example that you outlined is the exact kind of like faulty one, if you will, where I would rather, and I'm doing some of this. Okay. So I'm a known zero running back, bro. Right. So this is going to be a fun draft for us with you taking Bijan in the first round. We can kind of, counteract each other. I'm drafting very little to none of the early round running backs. I'm mixing in a little bit of Achane. I'm mixing in a little bit of Kyron as they kind of now become, third round picks or whatever. And I already have 2 elite wide receivers at that point. But and I'm not saying that that's the right answer. I'm just saying that's the approach that I'm taking to this tournament. And so I'm clearly going to be well overweight. I'm going to be, 0% Breece Hall and a much higher percentage of the other first round wide receivers. But to your point, I'm not really picking and choosing. It's kind of, because I'm fading a Breece Hall or a Bijan Robinson or something, and I have 0% of those guys, I then also don't want to compound that bet to say, okay, I'm fading the running backs and I'm fading this wide receiver and I'm fading this guy. It's like you made your bet already. Then to take it to the point, like you mentioned, okay, now I'm going to do 23% AJ Brown and 4% Puka Nacua or whatever. I feel like that is a little bit of just kind of haphazard drafting and just like kind of, this guy's, he's available at 11. So I'll take him at 11, even though he goes 8th. I'll take him at 11. It's kind of not really accomplishing anything. And I want to be really intentional in my drafts. A big perk of the tools and everything that you guys are doing here with your strategy is like, I'm being really intentional with the things that I'm trying to do in my drafts and the portfolio that I'm putting together. When I'm just like randomly assigning 3% to the guys, like how much am I really accomplishing with 3% of that guy and 20% of the other guy? I could flatten that out maybe to the other wide receivers in the first round. And so it's a great example where I'm actually dealing with that myself in all of these drafts where, okay, I got 15% of this guy, 10% of this guy. Maybe now this is the right time to take the 10% guy just to even that out a little bit.
Yeah, it's someone asked in the chat, you have 10 to 13% Tyreek through Gibbs. It's not exactly that, but I'm looking obviously at my exposures, and those ones are less than the others. And that's probably just the luck of the draw. I haven't had as many 101s and 102s, which is why I don't have 9% CeeDee Lamb or 9% Christian McCaffrey. So I'm going to go with another player that I have. And this is going to be an interesting build for me because I'm probably just going with players where I have 0 combinations of them thus far. Like I know for sure of my 8 Bijan teams now, I have 0 that have that combination of DJ Moore and Deebo Samuel. Now, how I'm going to build that out remains to be seen. But I think I'm at the point now where I've done, 300 plus drafts, and I can start looking at. And you're on the clock. I'll let you. There you go, Derrick Henry. Okay, or Tank Dell. All right,
Tank baby.
Okay. So I think I'm trying to do, you were talking about this with your pod you just did with JJ Zacharias, and JJ was on last week. So it's kind of like this weird circle of involved, done drafts together in the last week. But, you talked about something that I think is important as we get into a different season of drafting with people that may not have drafted for the last 3 months. They don't have 50 previous BBMs where they're drafting against themselves, essentially. But you're starting to basically say, I'm trying to build different combinations of the base teams that I've already been building. Like you just said, you might be fading a player like Breece or Bijan, but you have a bunch of teams that have started with Puka and Devontae Adams or whatever it might be.
Right.
And now you're trying to build those out with different combinations, because those have been where your bets have already been. You're betting on that strategy, that macro strategy working, but you still want to differentiate probably between the next 4 to 5 rounds after that to get some diversification, because you maybe didn't diversify as much as I did in the early rounds.
100%. And I think that right now is such a good time to the early rounds can be a little trickier, right? With your diversification, it's an art, right? We're painting, we're throwing paint at the wall, diversifying around in our early round picks, and it later, this time of year, we're going to get so much news coming in that's going to move guys around and maybe influence our exposures and the combinations of players that we have. But what I'm really trying to do right now is, the first couple rounds are really not going to change that much. Like, the news that's happening right now is going to, a perfect example of something like you were just mentioning is, I have a bunch of these. So right, I just drafted Garrett Wilson and Nico Collins. I have a handful of those already in Best Ball Mania, and Tank Dell is one of my highest owned wide receivers. But as news is starting to change, and I'm already thinking about things that are going on later in the draft, some guys that maybe I was not targeting before this last week when camp started to open up. So I'm going to say it, and maybe we'll get sniped. It is what it is. But, so the Deneric Prince news is like getting a little bit hot and heavy now, that every single time they go to practice, he is the backup running back to Isaiah Pacheco. And I don't have any Deneric Prince. And especially being more of a zero running back drafter, I'm taking a lot of late running backs. And if there's a backup running back on the Chiefs that's available to me late, and it's not CEH, who everybody else has been taking, I'm really interested in that. And so thinking about those combinations and being like, there's new players later available to me. Now I'm gonna play around in the early rounds. Maybe I have this combination already, or I don't. And now let's bolt on Deneric Prince to that team, because maybe you were taking whoever, right? Maybe you were taking CEH before, or you were taking your other favorite last round running back on those teams. It's like you can start to really massage and move around those chess pieces at this time of the year, and being really cognizant of that and keeping that in mind is like, it's huge, man. It's everything, honestly. Like last year, I'm not trying to call Deneric Prince Kyron Williams. Deneric Prince is probably more of like Zamir White or Ty Chandler last year than he is, Kyron Williams. But if he is actually the Chiefs' backup running back, that's a really powerful thing to pounce on immediately. And like you, same as you, I've drafted, 70 BBM teams already. I was never even thinking about Deneric Prince until this point.
And to be fair, you shouldn't have until, you know what I mean? That is a very stupid, and I was just going to add this, that, well, continue your point. I'll hit it in a second. Go ahead.
No, but I agree. You can adjust to the new information that's now coming. That's the whole point of drafting now until the season is we're about to get information that we didn't know before, and we shouldn't have been drafting those guys before. But now we learned something and we can adapt to it. And I want to take this time to really be, again, intentional about, okay, I'm thinking about these guys later in that draft. And so in these early rounds, how am I putting those? Okay, yeah, normally maybe I drafted a little bit too much of Tank Dell with Garrett Wilson, but now like there's this other available option to me later that I was never drafting before. And I don't have that guy on. And what if he is the Zamir White or the Ty Chandler or the Kyron Williams or whatever of this year? Now let's double back and bolt that guy on. And then, the rest of the week or, tomorrow when we draft another team, I don't have to do that. I don't have to take that same combination. This time of year is so good for those, like pouncing on that news and then figuring out how to massage putting those players together, because it's all a huge puzzle. And I want to put those puzzle pieces together.
Yeah, it's interesting you brought up the Deneric Prince news, because I was looking at this data a couple weeks ago, and I talked about with JJ last week, and I've hammered this home all offseason, that basically if you're drafting, and I'm curious what you do here after going the 4 straight receivers start. So I'll let you make your pick since you are on the clock. And then I have a question for you about your build. So 2 questions before you go back around. What are you thinking here?
I'm going to Kyle Pitts. I was probably actually going to take Jaden Reed if he fell back. It wasn't like a big fall for him, but there's a little bit of, negative buzz around Jaden Reed, and I'm like totally neutral on him. I don't have a big, I don't have a ton of Jaden Reed. I don't have zero Jaden Reed. And so it's like been the perfect time for me to just kind of up that Jaden Reed exposure. I really like the Green Bay Packers as a stack. I really like Jordan Love's price. So I've been trying to scoop up a little bit more Jaden Reed, in the late fifth, as opposed to like the early fifth where he was going before. Obviously, he goes right in front of me. And so being really wide receiver heavy, it's the perfect time to dive in at tight end. And maybe after this year, I'll give in on Kyle Pitts. But you're not going to catch me giving in on Kyle Pitts when they get Kirk Cousins and a new. I'm not done. I'm not done with Kyle Pitts, and I think his price is awesome for the talent. And then when you start, like I said, when you start a bunch of wide receivers, he's one of my favorite tight ends to draft. So another guy who, to the conversation we were just having, that I don't have. I was just like hammering him early in drafts, and then I don't really have as much in the last couple of weeks or so. And so kind of coming back now to maybe some guys I'll take late with some news. Kyle Pitts is a good guy to double back to for me.
So let's say you were on the clock here. What you gonna do?
This is a guy I'm trying to get my exposure up to or up on in Ladd McConkey. Sure. What my co-founder of Spike Week, he goes by Hacker. Nobody knows his real name, which is a fun tech wizard internet thing to do. But he keeps calling Ladd McConkey this year's Puka, and it's probably infiltrating my brain that's coming in. But I've just been like very, very neutral on Ladd. I think it's a little bit of sticker shock, to be totally honest. I'm a huge fan of Ladd. I was a big fan of him, like in the big board and early drafts before the NFL draft. I love his prospect profile. I love him as a player. But then 6th round, Ladd McConkey was a little bit, like I said, sticker shock. But I don't want to pass on a player who I really like in a situation that's clearly advantageous for him to just take over the Chargers passing game. And, being a zero running back bro like I am, staying on course with the wide receivers early is something I'm like really trying to stick to.
Yeah, I think it's important. I was going to ask you, why not Zay Flowers instead of T. Higgins with the Texans exposure? Is that something that you consider there? Is that something that you have a bunch of Texans already with like a bunch of Tank Dell with Zay Flowers already? Because it's very easy to stack those two together. I wanted to get the answer on that first.
Yeah, so I actually like straight up prefer T to Zay Flowers. It's very close. It's very close. I'm not. We're splitting hairs on those two for sure. But I have a bunch of both Nico and Tank with Zay Flowers. It's kind of like the way that I convince myself to force Zay in is because I'm taking a bunch of those early Texans wide receivers. And something I'm really trying to do, I'm curious how you've been handling this too, is you can get a lot of so both of these two quarterbacks are the perfect example. I actually wasn't thinking about having both of them on this team, but you can get CJ Stroud to fall and you can get Joe Burrow to fall, both of them, if you have those wide receivers. And so I've been trying to really like force a little bit more. Jamar Chase goes in the top 5, so there's not much you can do, but force even more of the Texans wide receivers and force more of T. Higgins, because I know that, like, dude, sometimes Joe Burrow is here at like pick 105 or something like that. Sometimes CJ Stroud falls a round and a half after ADP, but the way to pounce on it is by having those other guys. And the way to press the room is by having those wide receivers, because nobody else is then incentivized to take that quarterback. So knowing that there are more Ravens who I like later in terms of that, you mentioned the Ravens with the Texans guys. That's a week 17 game that we're all excited about, but there's a bunch of Ravens actually later that I'm pretty interested in, whether it be Tez Walker or doing the Rashad Bateman thing again for the third year in a row. I'll need another tight end. Isaiah Likely, the drumbeat is getting pretty nice on him, that maybe he is actually, for the first time ever, a second tight end is actually going to play a little bit more next to Mark Andrews. There's other Ravens available to me later that I don't want to force Zay Flowers. I wanted to keep my flexibility open.
Yeah, I'm going to be up here in a second, and this has been a very, very chalk draft. I mean, CJ Stroud probably going to fall in your lap. I don't want to jinx it, but I think I'm going to push it. I think I'm going to push it one more pick and reach a little bit on JMO. Just get a little correlation in there with JMO. But that's also because this room is absolutely fading running back into oblivion. I mean, the next 10 players in ADP are running back. So I'm with Bijan. I'm going to push the room a little bit more. Hopefully we see oh man, there goes that Stroud.
That's hilarious.
Yeah.
Does
let's
he have
see.
Digs? He has Digs.
He does have, he does Digs and Flowers. So it's not a completely, naked pick. So.
I get it. I get you. The tilting part is when they don't when you have Nico Tank and they don't have Diggs, and they're the one that no pushback.
I'm gonna like that guy right there that went Kyler after taking Richardson and probably sniped a couple teams probably waiting for Kyler. The Marvin McBride managers coming back probably were waiting for Kyler to come back in round 8, and of course the guy with Richardson needed to take him. I have been doing this. I have been entering chunks of slow drafts at different periods of times. That is where I take the falling ADP value.
Yeah.
Man, I'll wake up. I'm on the clock. I see a Trevor Lawrence a round and a half past ADP, 0 correlation. That's where I'll take them because it's too hard when you're doing lives to really kind of see through the falling ADP value. I mean, you can see it on your screen like, hey, this ADP is far below where it should be. But in those, it feels like it's a lot easier to actually plan around what you're going to do. And you don't even expect it to happen. But I don't know if you've thought of anything like that that's where I take my falling ADP value. I don't focus as much on it in live. I focus a lot more on correlating in live drafts just because there's so much going on at one time.
Yeah, it's a good point. I've been doing a lot more slow drafts this year because I'm trying to draft about as many teams as possible. I'm drafting tons of, the puppies and chihuahuas and everything. Of course, I'm maxing Bestball Mania. But in order to get that volume in, it's very helpful to be able to fire a bunch of slows. I also really like what you mentioned. This is something I'm doing as well. Enter and shout out to Underdog. You can bulk enter slow. You don't have to keep clicking the button. It was a really nice upgrade that they made. You can put in 10 today and then wait 4 or 5 days and then put in another 10 and you'll end. It's really great for your experience as a drafter. You can be at different points in the draft instead of it gets a little painful to come on the clock and all these slows and you're like, all right, I'm in the 4th round again. And okay, I took T Higgins here. It's okay, I'm going to take T Higgins again in the 4th round. You keep clicking the same guys or making the same decisions in all of your slows every single day. It gets a little bit monotonous. And so I really like that idea of spacing out but bulk enter a bunch, bulk enter 10 today, wait a week or wait a few days, enter another 10 or 20 or however many works for you. And that has been really helpful for me. But to your point, I do find it easier to make those decisions in slow drafts versus when I get into a live draft like this. A lot of the times I maybe have an idea of what I want to do coming in. Some people will frown upon that, but I've been thinking about something and we open up the draft. I'm the 109. I'm oh, I know how it goes from the one, I know how it goes from the 109. It's Puka or AJ Brown or Garrett Wilson or something. And I kind of start to think about what I want to do in that draft. And you can't really analyze every single thing when you're on the clock. You got 30 seconds. You kind of got to take best player available or whatever's top of mind in the slow draft. And again, it helps with our spike week tools is I can look at every minute detail of when I get on the board, right? Like you mentioned, Trevor Lawrence, okay, how much Trevor Lawrence do I have? How many Trevor Lawrence and Brian Thomas stacks do I have? Because I took Brian Thomas in this draft. How many times did I take Trevor Lawrence with CeeDee Lamb? How many, you can like really dig into all of those details and then match it up to the ADP value. Like you mentioned, who's this falling guy? Should I just take him or should I, deviate from that because of XYZ? I do find it really helpful. But I still like, I love the fast drafts. There's nothing better than just hopping in, drafting for 40 minutes and chopping it up with somebody. So it's a push pull, but I kind of love that we have all those different options.
Yeah. I mean, the fast drafts with Spike Week, I just like to sit back, and it's a little harder when you're on a stream and you have to talk through everything, but I love just I've tried to make it a habit. Wake up in the morning before everybody's awake. I know there's people from other countries and in different time zones that are drafting, but wake up, fire up Spike Week, do a live draft, and it's literally a roadmap. It doesn't give you the answers, but you have enough time to kind of sift through it while you're drafting to perfectly. I mean, some of the best teams I've drafted that are almost 100% correlated are using the Spike Week tool, win on the clock, when doing slow drafts. And it's key. It's the slow drafts that it works. So I want to bring up a point from we were talking about earlier. I'm curious what you're going to do here. I just took my third running back with Tony Pollard, Raheem Mostert. I prefer not taking Raheem Mostert, and I prefer Tajay Spears, but this is another one where I'm going opposite, where I'm trying to hit on some players I have low ownership and low combinations with. I had 0 Raheem Mostert with any of my top 3 picks.
Oh, wow.
And earlier, so I took Bijan, but I had over 30% Kyle Pitts and or Terry McLaurin with my Bijans. So I could have got a lot of people would reach, half a round to get Terry McLaurin because it's a flat receiver zone, or would have reached to get Kyle Pitts and then build a Atlanta stack or whatever. But I was overexposed with my Atlanta with either McLaurin or Kyle Pitts with Bijan. But back to your point, I want to go back to the beginning. We're going to go all over the place, but the idea with the Deneric Prince argument, I wanted to hit this home because we're going to get a lot of news coming up here in the next 3-4 weeks. Now, whether it's real news or fake news, it's going to be news that's going to shift people's opinions on who to draft late.
Yeah.
And I was working on this data. I know there's a lot of people that have crunched this type of data too, that when you draft a receiver outside of like the top 80 in receiver ADP, the expectation is that they hit your lineup one time. Like legitimately, it's like 1.8 times on average they've hit your lineup over the last 3 years, receivers with that ADP. Now, if you think about the flaw in that, given that statement, Eric, 1 to 2 times they're going to hit your lineup. One thing has to be true. That's hitting your lineup just looking at it as a macro level. How many times did that player actually hit a lineup, right? But that doesn't mean it hit your lineup. That Nelson Aguilar that you took with Lamar Jackson as your 9th receiver, that's a good pick. I want to correlate receivers after that range. But what if Nelson Aguilar has his best game of the year, but my other 3 starting receivers also had 20-point games? His 1 week happened, right? You got the pick right, but you couldn't actually use the pick. But that just speaks to I don't think the receivers in the later rounds are going to change as much in terms of who people are drafting before we know who to draft, if that makes sense. Like Nelson Aguilar is Nelson Aguilar. His role is probably his role, and that's probably not going to change much. Whereas the running backs, I think there is a ton of running back changes that are going to happen to the point where Clyde Edwards-Helaire will not be getting drafted. This running back will not be getting drafted. And now Deneric Prince goes to, I've been taking Estime in the round 16, 17, because in a week he's going to be in round 14. And even though he wasn't being drafted early, he's the kind of guy that all it's going to take is anything within the first 2 weeks of real, like padded practices. That's like, okay, he should be going where Tyler Algier is going, you know what I mean? Where Zach Charbonnet is going. It's not going to take much for him to get there. But to the running backs, like the running backs are going to switch out 1 for 1 for somebody else, whereas taking a random Trey Palmer, Trey Tucker, Nelson Aguilar, those are almost all going to be only rostered largely with Lamar, right? With whoever, Baker Mayfield with Trey Palmer. Like They're only going to be correlated. Does that make sense? Whereas the running backs
100%.
are going to be all over the place. So talk about your thinking through that subject and how that changes how you draft early. Because I think it makes it more comfortable to lean into like a zero RB strategy, knowing that the variation and getting more leverage against ownership in the overall tournament is going to happen more easily, I think, later on with these running backs, especially as their ADPs move around.
Yeah, it's a huge perk of not even just zero running back, but even like what you're doing, taking a hero running back approach with Bijan and then kind of, hitting the middle tier and closing out your running back room later. It happens, that diversification happens organically through just the things that we learn during this time. You didn't plan for it. It was just, oh, by the way, CH isn't the backup in Kansas City. So now you have this new guy, right? Oh, Audric Estime might be a lot better than we thought he was in, he's not a last round pick. He should be a 14th round pick or a 13th round pick, just as you mentioned. And so it's a huge part of how I'm drafting right now. Something that I do think about what you said with the wide receivers versus the running backs is so key, because the wide receiver stuff, the role, like the projected role, is generally priced in already. And then even if it's not priced in, we kind of just said, all right, there's some youthful upside that even if he's not a starter day one, take a Javon Baker or something. Like, sure, if he was running with the ones today as we're recording this, he might move up a little bit, but he's already not a last round pick, generally speaking, because he's a rookie and the Patriots have an open depth chart. Like, it's kind of already priced in such a way that we get it. We get what Javon Baker is. He could move up a little bit. Then Nelson Aguilar, such a great example is Aguilar, where like, what could possibly happen over the next, like, what would it take? Zay and Andrews get hurt in the next month or something for Aguilar to move. And even then it's like, he's still Nelson Aguilar. Like, it's still not really, really moving the needle. And so we know what those guys are. And so this is such a good time to pounce on those running backs, because those are the guys that are really, we're going to learn things that like are earth-shattering in terms of changes, and we do every year. It's so easy to use the Kyron Williams example from last year because it was such a unicorn event, where we actually get the Rams starting running back and he's really good and he wasn't being drafted for most of the summer. That's probably not going to happen, but we do get a lot of learning the depth charts later. We get a lot of, oh, this guy's the backup, not this guy, right? The generic Prince CEH one is just so happens to be top of mind. We get the Estime is the backup, or like the 1B on the Broncos, or, we get a lot of that type stuff. Rico, you probably remember last year, there was a long stretch where people were taking Deuce Vaughn as the second Cowboys running back. And it was like, guys, he's 160 pounds. I don't think he's really going to be but we didn't know. And we found out very quickly it was Rico Dowdle who was the backup Cowboys running back. Clearly that didn't lead to a lot of fantasy goodness, but we learned really valuable information in a high value backfield, a high value situation, that this running back is now the backup to Tony Pollard. We're going to get a ton of that stuff over the course of the next month and a half. And so those are the guys that, like, I'm really not that worried about these late round wide receivers. There's a couple, I'm keeping tabs on the Bengals situation with Jermaine Burton versus Yoshi versus Charlie Jones. Like, I'm keeping tabs on some of those. I think that they could be valuable, but like comparing them to the wide receiver situations, it's just like, it's apples and oranges. The running backs are the guys who right now I'm really, really locked into in the late rounds.
Yeah. I mean, you're just talking about, like, it's going to be really hard to get closing line value on receivers just because it's hard for a receiver to, even if those injuries happen with the Ravens, conceivably, how high does Nelson Aguilar move? It's not like he's going to go to wide receiver 50. You know what I mean? No, he's just going to be drafted at a higher percentage. Hell, I've even said that you actually don't want some of these later receivers to get much buzz, because if you have them properly correlated with the right builds, The last thing you want is more people to be drafting them. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like you do not want Nelson Aguilar to be drafted in 25% of drafts when all of your exposure and, to a player like that shouldn't be super high, but you don't want your Aguilar exposure to be against 20% of people that have him in Bestball Mania 5 versus what's he going to be? He's going to be probably like a sub 1% drafted player across the tournament. Yeah. So the ones I have, I've already made the bet correlating those with Texans or definitely on Lamar Jackson teams. I don't want any more people coming in and going, wait a second, he's ahead of Tez Walker. Rashad Bateman's also injured. Now we have to start taking him at wide receiver 80 instead of wide receiver 110 where nobody else is drafting him. So I think that's something that people don't really think about is the ownership percentage versus the range of outcomes, especially at receivers. You may tell me that let me try to pick a random receiver since we're on the far turn from us. Let me find one that just gets drafted in. Okay, here's one. Tyler Boyd. He's going to have a 99% ownership percentage in Bestball Mania 5, right? He's not probably A, any good. B, probably not really a player that has anything left to go upwards from what he is, right? No. So profile-wise, he's not a good pick in general. But he's an awful pick when 99% of drafts are going to be taking him, right? Versus Treylon Burks is probably a better pick because nobody is going to draft him. But then you add to that, Eric, you'll see a random team that has 7 receivers already. They have no Jaguars or Titans or Will Levis, and they just take Tyler Boyd as their wide receiver 8. Right? Like, I mean, you see that all the time, and it's like, well, just because he's wide receiver 87, and let me see a couple picks down, Elijah Moore is wide receiver 95. Like, their ownership percentage may be 20% different because Elijah Moore was not getting drafted a lot in early drafts. Yep. So it's just weird. People make those mistakes, and you don't think about that. But to win a tournament of this many people, or even just to get to the finals, like you're going to want to have, if you're lucky enough to get out of 150, 1 or 2 teams to the finals, you know what I mean? You want it to have all of these things locked in place. You don't want to go, damn it, I have Jared Goff, and instead of Khalif Raymond, I have Tyler Boyd. You know what I mean? Like you're going to be kicking yourself when it gets there that you didn't follow that structure. So I just want to hit that home for everybody that's watching.
It's so true. And I made the BBM finals last year and got 12th overall. And it's funny because I only drafted 2 tight ends on that team, and it was Sam Laporta and Cole Turner was the second tight end. Clearly, Cole Turner, huge whiff, right? Didn't go well for old Cole Turner. But the idea of what leads me to guys like Cole Turner is exactly what you're talking about. And it led me to, I, of course, had a big old bag of Kyren Williams because I was monitoring the news, right? And like looking at the Rams situation and being like, I don't really like Cam Akers. So what's going on, in the backup situation here? And I did really like Kyren as a prospect. So until he ran like a 5.2 40, that was, suboptimal. But I was really like just staying in tune with that situation. And then you also see, just as you mentioned, there's running backs. I don't mean to keep piling on CEH, but like CEH is going to be drafted, or up until this point has been drafted in basically every draft in Best Ball Mania. 99.9% CEH is drafted. There's a bunch of running backs not drafted in the majority of these drafts. And that happened with Kyren fucking Williams last year. The league winner of all league winners was drafted. Even think about, we got the like real concrete Kyren news sometime in August, probably, where we were like, oh no, like this guy's like, we need to take him in every draft. He was still only drafted in 25% of Best Ball Mania drafts. 25%. 3 out of 4 drafts in Best Ball Mania, Kyren Williams was not even selected in your Best Ball Mania draft. And so when you think about that, and then you start to think about what's about to happen for the next couple of months, and then you think about the Tyler Boyds, and you're like, sure, I know Tyler Boyd is like gonna run some routes. So like, it makes me feel a little cozier when I pick them. But like, that's not really how you win this tournament. You win this tournament with looking for that Kyron Williams, that Deneric Prince, that I remember a few years ago, the like Sony Michel's and stuff. Like, Sony Michel was on the Patriots and ended up on the Rams, and he was drafted like 10% of the time in Best Ball Mania. And it's like, sure, was that chaos and a little bit of luck? Yeah, but guess what you need to win this whole thing? You need this absurd outlier outcome and just falling in line with how everybody else is drafting and taking the same guys that everybody else is taking, especially at the end of the draft. It's just really not how you win this thing. And I think it's something that really gets lost a little bit in this. So I love that you brought it up, and it still floors me, honestly, thinking about the Kyron thing, like the ownership, like you mentioned with Aguilar or whoever, or Tyler Boyd, think about that. Kyron Williams was only drafted in 1 out of every 4 Best Ball Mania drafts last year, and now he's a 3rd round pick and was a 2nd round pick for the long. Puka Nacua was not that different, and he's a 1st round pick now. So like, that's the up. Is that going to happen again? Probably not. But like, that's the upside case. You can get a next year 1st round pick drafted in 1 out of every 4 drafts. Kyron Williams, despite being the biggest smash of all time, was only 15% in the Best Ball Mania finals. He's the reason why I did well. Like, lads, he was drafted so little that he couldn't possibly be popular in the finals. And like, that's the dream. That's the goal we all want, is this stone cold smash who just can't even be popular no matter how well they do.
Yeah, I think that's a huge point, and that makes me want to ask your opinion on, if I'm going to max center, which I am, and I have to do 75 more drafts. I mean, how many would you hold back, knowing that there's going to be news that happens in the 3rd week of the preseason that is going to vault some players that, even if they don't get vaulted up past round 18 or round 17, you're now locks to have to draft them, versus knowing that 85% of the drafts that have gone by, they've only been taken 10% of those.
Right.
That, does it make sense to hold back like 20% of these drafts just for that reason, barring that I have the time to, because I also don't want to do those drafts slow, because then they take forever and people will wait on the clock and they'll take those players that do have the closing line value. But it does feel like, if I have time to get in 2-3 slow drafts a day in the last 2 weeks of the preseason, that is more advantageous against this exact thing that we're talking about, trying to beat a big field, is maybe take advantage of players that we're not getting drafted. I know we don't get ownership percentages in Underdog, but it's pretty clear you can tell the players that were not being taken early if you've been drafting all season. Does it make sense to hold back like 30 of these drafts and just not touch them and plan to do them like the weekend or week before, like Labor Day weekend, just to get them in with all the newest information?
I think so. I hold back a bunch of my, so the beauty of the best ball landscape now is that if you want to keep drafting, we do have options. 3-4 years ago, it was Best Ball Mania, and that was it. And maybe the DraftKings Millie, we would have like 2 or 3 tournaments the whole summer. So you had to really think about when to do your drafts, because it wasn't a big issue to get in 150 drafts over the course of 4 months or 5 months. Now, I mean, if you went to the Underdog lobby away from the draft board, just keep scrolling, man. There's like a million tournaments available to you. You can draft in constantly around the clock all summer. So I try to keep, for Best Ball Mania, for like the main tournaments, I try to keep, I don't have an exact target number, but like you said, 30, 40, something for like the last 2 weeks, once we get the final preseason information, once all the main preseason stuff happens, I really try to, and then, you got to tell the wife, like, you're going to hate me for the next 2 weeks, because I'm just going to be in the lab. I'm going to be drafting a million teams at a time, right? Just like, sorry, we're going to draft like 300 teams in the next 2 weeks. But it is a great time to be able to, it's also great for your portfolio, right? Like, to be able to mix and match some of this stuff and figure out where your gaps are, And then comparing that to, we just talked about some of these guys. Where am I missing things? What combinations of players do I not have? And then mapping that with, oh, by the way, now this running back is a pick that you've never taken all summer, but you still got 30 more picks, 40 more picks to prioritize that guy. And okay, so he was an 18th round pick. Now you're taking him in the 16th round. Who cares? They're all $1 auction players. You're in an auction draft. They all still cost $1. So who cares? You can take them, you can move them around the board. It gives you so much flexibility that I really do like to keep whatever everybody feels comfortable with themselves. Time is the only thing we can't replace, right? You only have so much time in a day, but like keeping a chunk of those teams for, from now, once training camp starts to happen until the end. Like, shout out to the folks who've already like maxed Bestball Mania. I respect them. It's an impressive grind, but I kind of think you're doing yourself a little bit of a disservice, because from now until the end of the season is when we're going to learn all this really, really impactful information.
Yeah, dude, I was going to ask you about that when you mentioned that. I've heard numerous people say they've already maxed it. I've seen some people on X already bragging, I maxed it by the end of June, you know what I mean? But doesn't it, and I'll let you make your pick here, doesn't it feel that the only thing that can happen now is your teams just slowly die?
Yeah, exactly. There's like
you don't even want to look, because like every preseason weekend you have like 2 or 3 teams that are now dead because there's 2 players that are not going to be live. You know what I mean? Like it just, I don't know about that. I don't know about that. That feels like one of those things that you do it and then you regret it immediately.
You're describing my life. I think it was 2 years ago. I know that but Darrington Evans, no longer in the NFL. He's a Madden streamer now, which tells you a lot about how terrible the fact that he was my highest owned running back 2 years ago was. That he's not only not in the NFL anymore, he's playing video games for a living. But he was the backup to Derrick Henry. He was a 3rd round pick. I thought he was an interesting prospect or whatever, but he was like undrafted for most of the summer. I kind of spotted that situation where I was fading first. This was Derrick Henry was drafted in the 1st round that year. I was fading Derrick Henry, 28-year-old non-pass catching running back in the 1st round. It's not really my cup of tea. So I was like, okay, how can I like extrapolate that fade? Well, no other Titans running backs were being drafted. I targeted Darrington, and I actually feel directionally accurate about this. But to the exact point that you just made, I was sitting here. So I'm in this office. I have a TV in front of me. I was watching week 1 of the preseason, and Darrington rips off a long, like 25 first play of the Titans week 1 preseason game, rips off a long run. And I'm like,
I remember it. I remember it to this day.
I'm victory lapping like, I told you, motherfuckers, like this. I was right, whatever. 2 plays later, pops a hammy. 2 plays later, he pops a hammy. And like my whole, I just spent hours and hours and hours drafting this guy. And I feel like I was right. And guess what? He's on IR to start the season, and he kind of came back, but he was useless, right? And that ended up being the Donta Foreman comes in for the Titans later. Derrick Henry actually did get hurt that year, but it ended up being Donta Foreman because Darrington Evans got hurt. And if you spend all your chips, I'm not saying you could have course corrected on Darrington Evans, but I'm saying those kind of situations happen every year, absolutely every year. And if you don't like keep some bullets in the chamber, you're not going to be able to capitalize on the different times when we have different information and we identify different players that just weren't available to us in the player pool before.
Got a little tilted there on that snipe. I tried to build a 3rd QB bring back with Darius Slayton because there's some correlation there, and Darius Slayton goes to a random team with zero
17th round.
Yeah. Zero correlation.
Darius Slayton with 0 correlation is that's interesting. But it's a Rashad Bateman team. So that Rashad Bateman and Darius Slayton, I feel like have a lot of correlation in the types of people that will draft. Those guys.
It's a team that has Lamar and Jaden Daniels. They have 0 Colts, and they have 3 Giants. So maybe they're a Giants fan, but they have Tracy, Wan'Dale Robinson, and Darius Slayton. So you'd think that might have been the team that goes, you know what, maybe I'll take Daniel Jones, but they already had 2 higher end quarterbacks. So thinking of Darrington Evans, man, it's the name that comes to mind when you mention Darrington Evans. It feels a lot like Kendre Miller. Just may never fire. It just may never fire. You got a lot of Kendre Miller?
Oh yeah. Kendre, I wrote up a whole puff piece on Kendre Miller this year, and the runway is there. You couldn't dream up a better situation for a running. The beauty of the Kendre situation is most of the time we need like an injury or something really chaotic to happen for one of these guys to be a fantasy smash, and that's not the case. Someone might say you need a Kamara injury or something. I don't think that that's the case. Alvin Kamara can exist, and Kendre Miller can be an awesome fantasy asset. Like, look at the Saints for 10 years, right? Mark Ingram and Latavius Murray and Chris Ivory, and all these guys are great fantasy assets alongside the Alvin Kamaras of the world, Darren Sproles, whatever. And so the runway is just perfect. I love the potentially really talented player in a situation where he doesn't need an injury to exceed. And that's it for Kendre. But Dennis Allen, I think Dennis Allen's just an asshole. Like I think Dennis Allen just hates life. He's just miserable as the Saints head coach. But I do think that every day I get a little bit more worried about Kendre. We'll see. The injury stuff is a huge issue, but I'm keeping I'm keeping a light on for Kendre, but it's concerning for sure. But he's one of my guys. I want more information. He's a great guy for like us having this conversation right now, and to be like, monitor this. You have
Correct.
2 more months. You have a month and a half to monitor this Saints situation. When we get to week 1 and you're like, oh no. It's not Kendre at all. That's good to know, but I want to be out ahead of it, and I'm willing to burn some teams if in a month I feel stupid for drafting a bunch of Kendre Miller, because I think that we could also get to the point that like week 1 he's the starter, alongside
Correct.
Alvin Kamara. That's very possible.
Or week 1, well, the last week of the season he goes on short-term IR, and he's going to miss the first 6 weeks. And Jamal Williams, everybody's drafting in the last 2 weeks going, man, this guy probably can run into a touchdown or 2. Guys like Roschon Johnson, Deontay Foreman, they're getting drafted in every draft. I mean, truthfully, what's the difference between Deontay Foreman and Jamal Williams?
Just we can perceive a role, right? We can see Nick Chubb is hurt, and Deontay
People
Foreman
like the running backs ahead of Jamal Williams better. That's it.
Yeah.
They don't like Jerome Ford. They don't like Nick Chubb. So let's just slide in Deontay Foreman. But if
Nick Chubb was healthy, we would never dream of taking Deontay Foreman. It's the same thing. Your point is so spot on.
But if Kendre Miller's not healthy, now we're going to go, okay, Deontay Foreman versus, because Chubb already went on the pup. He's probably not going to be ready. So Foreman I think Foreman has been a good pick that as it starts to get, and this is something Pat Kerrane talks about all the time. Like, as soon as the real news happens that like Nick Chubb is not going to play in the first month of the season at minimum, it'll be like, oh man, maybe I should start taking Deontay Foreman in round 15 instead of round 17 or 18. But that's the only edge you will get. So I don't mind taking him as much as possible now because I foresee that happening. But that could easily happen with how many other backfields where the number 2 is not going to be available. Could be, this is gross, but what if Chuba Hubbard gets injured? Now you're going, okay, Miles Sanders and Jamal Williams versus Deontay Foreman. I'd much rather have Miles Sanders or, Jamal Williams because nobody's taking them. Everybody's taking Jamal Williams.
They're 1%.
Deontay Foreman.
Deontay Foreman is 99.9%. Those guys are 1%. And it's such the perfect example of, for the next 45 days, that's all the stuff we got to be like so locked in on. And I think, you mentioned it earlier that the running backs and the backfields are where it's the most impactful. There's very, very, very few wide receiver situations or tight end situations where that can happen. But like that's so much of a part of the game. Like everybody wants to be like, who's your favorite 7th round pick? And that's great. I'm not saying that there's not an edge in, those player takes in the first X amount of rounds. I have players I'm higher on and players I'm lower on, just like I'm sure you do. But the stuff that we can really, really pounce on and really create an edge is when there's not a this year's Kyron Williams. Like that was a pretty unicorn event. But this year's next guy who propels himself, it happens every year. So that is not a unicorn event. Maybe it's Eli Mitchell, maybe it's Kyron Williams, maybe it's like I mentioned, Sony Michel, maybe it's Darrington Evans, maybe I don't know who the heck it's going to be. None of us do, but it's going to happen. And so you better be ready. You can't stick your head in the sand and just say, no, I know it's CEH, right? I'm just going to keep drafting CEH. I'm going to keep drafting Donta Foreman, because then when Deneric Prince or Jamal Williams or Miles Sanders or whoever pops up, hopefully it's one of my guys. Evan Hall needs to put this Trey Sermon shit to the side. I'm done with the Trey Sermon hype. That's enough. I need one of those guys to pop up. Once they do, it's like you now have a generational wealth opportunity, like Kyron Williams was and like Puka Nacua was. Are you going to be ready to pounce, or are you going to be stubborn with your head in the sand? I would rather be the one that's pouncing on those situations.
So I'm going to pull up the teams here in a second. Just we'll go over each one of our builds real quick. But for the people in here that have not drafted as many teams as us, where you're not playing against yourself and your prior exposure and you're looking to diversify. But let's say you're listening to this and you want to throw $500 into Underdog and you want to draft 50 teams between now and the end of the season. You clearly don't have that edge of playing against some of your exposure, building teams differently. What do you think the most favorable, and funny, I'm looking at Tyler Boyd did not get drafted here. So that's one of those where
you made that happen. Yeah.
He did not go in this draft, which is,
99.8 now.
A higher than 200 ADP player did not get drafted here. That doesn't happen that often, but people that are just starting, that don't have an entire portfolio of teams. And I have a bunch on DraftKings and FFPC too. So I could give a shit about my exposure to certain players. Like, that's going to shake out in the end with maybe my bias and where it ends up after the start of the season. But I'm not looking at, I have so many teams across all of these different platforms. I'm not even personally focusing on, like, do I have too much of this player? Do I have too much of that player? It's all about trying to correlate as many teams as possible and build upon what I've already kind of gotten wrong in the first 3 months of drafting.
Yeah.
And trying to kind of fix some of those mistakes, kind of like hedging against the bets I've already made now that the odds are lowered in the casino. And so if you don't have the luxury of doing that, how would you attack, like, just starting today? Would it be leaning much more towards I know running backs are just going to go wild over the next month, and that would lean into, like, I'm not doing any builds where I'm taking 3 running backs in the first 10 rounds. Like, that's like the max. That way I know I have to take at least 2 or 3 more, and it's going to force myself to take the Jamal Williams or the Deontay Foremans. Like, I'm going to have to take different names there and make sure I capitalize on that. Whereas we just talked through this entire show about how we're going to be taking advantage of the new running backs that pop up. But if you go 4 running backs in the first 11 rounds, now you're, as a new player that doesn't have all of that old exposure, you're also probably locked out because you're going, damn, I need 9-10 receivers on this team. I can't take Deneric Prince. I can't take Jamal Williams or whoever it might be. So you're actually losing more so to the people that are coming in with already a bigger portfolio, if that makes sense.
No, it makes a ton of sense. And this, we played fantasy football a long time. I've done the Bestball thing for a long time. I'm used to a lot of the same questions. That's the first time I've been asked that question. So I love that. And I would say I'm not trying to be an anti-running back person when I say this. The reason why I'm drafting a lot of 0 running back teams or hero running back teams is strictly like an assessment of the market. It's not like I don't hate running. Like, you think I hate Christian McCaffrey? You think I hate Bijan Robinson? Like I'm not a moron. Like they look awesome. Like I really, really like them. I'm excited for their seasons. I'm excited to watch them play football. I think they're going to score a bunch of fantasy points. It's all about like the nuances of the game and the market that we're playing in. And so to the point that you just made, now is the perfect time to just not go overboard. I know you're coming in and you're saying, Saquon Barkley in the second round, Kyron Williams in the third round, Josh Jacobs in the fifth round, right? You're saying all like these running backs, we've never gotten these prices before on these types of running backs. And it feels like it's so hard to not take the guy who used to go in the second round when he's now going in the fifth or the sixth round. Like Joe Mixon is a sixth round pick, dude, as a workhorse running back who's been fantasy productive forever. And he's on an offense we all love. Who doesn't love that? I took 2 Texans wide receivers in this draft. We all love the Texans. And he goes in the sixth round. It feels like a bad price. But all running, like the market has said, I think it's efficient. We can argue about that till the cows come home. I think that you're going to always be able to get running backs at every point in the draft. You mentioned it during this draft. We reached like the 7th round and the whole people could only see the board, but the whole top of the queue was all running back. It was all running backs because you reach a certain point in the draft where people just don't really need running backs anymore, but they need all the other positions. And so you're going to get the value at the running back position. And then you compound this time of year, like we've talked about for the last hour, where guys are going to pop up. You're going to be like, oh, I would really like to draft an Eric Prince. But the moment you draft 5 running backs in the first 10 rounds, you screwed yourself out of taking Deneric Prince because you need so much other stuff for that lineup that you've now put together. And so it really is, the running back thing is kind of a mind fuck, if you will. Like it's like I'm going to take a worse player at these picks. You have to like train yourself to be like, look, I'm well aware that Joe Mixon is better than whatever wide receiver I'm taking. He's going to score more points most years than the player I'm taking over him at that spot. But you have to kind of train yourself that you're taking the best 18 player collection. You're not taking the best player every single pick that's going to score the most points. And this time of year, and especially for this thought experiment that like, new player coming in, I'm going to fire $500 in. Like you're going to be tempted to just take the best player every single time. And really you need to take the best 18-person team every single time. And that actually is going to require you to not take the best player every single time, as weird as that sounds, because you would have never got Kyron. You would have never got Puka. You would have never got Tank Dell. You would have never got any of these guys if all you did was take the best player available every single time. You have to build the best collection of players that can win you $1.5 million.
Yeah, we're going to have to come back another time and talk through just the theory of a lot of this stuff without the draft, because someone put up here, shout out to Taylor, how do you underdog show all the bye weeks and playoff matchups? That's spike week, my friend.
Yes,
what
sir.
You see in the background, it's really dummy proof. If you're drafting with this, you always know your correlation. There's a bunch of options. I actually have most of the shit turned off. I keep it very basic, just focused on week 16 and 17. As you can see right here, boom. Whether you like my team or not, it's very well correlated for the 2 playoff weeks. I have 6 game stacks. I think the structure of a 3-6-7-2 team, because I went 6 receivers in the first 8 rounds or whatever it was, like the structure is pretty close. Some people would have said maybe take 1 more receiver, but if you draft that much capital in the ones that I took, you're already betting on it. So I think the structure is good. The correlation is good. I got some stacks in there. All 3 of my quarterbacks have a stacked receiver or a tight end. I have bringbacks with pretty much every player and a bunch of week 16 and week 17 crossover correlation as well. Again, a 3-6-7-2 build, Brock Purdy, Jared Goff, Daniel Jones. People will give me shit for taking Brock Purdy and Jared Goff in the same draft. I'm okay doing that if you have a 3 QB build. I don't care about it if I have a 3 QB build. I probably don't want my only game out if I have a 2 QB build to be quarterbacks in the same game, but if I have exposure to multiple games, I don't mind. And the quarterbacks, as Dr. B said in here, he absolutely hated his team because the quarterbacks did go off pretty quick here. By the time I got to like where I took Daniel Jones, he was like QB 28 and the rest were gone. And that was like round 16. So they went quick in this draft, quicker than normal. But yeah, I mean, 3 quarterback build, took Bijan early, ended up with, as you said, Mostert, Pollard, Eckler, Jalen Wright, Trey Sermon. I love taking 2 of the 3 Miami running backs.
Yep.
Usually it's Jalen Wright with either Achane or Mostert. Yeah, I'm never taking Mostert and Achane on the same team, but I love tacking Jalen Wright on in a 6 RB build with one of those others. And then 7 receivers. I mean, I literally went Debo, DJ Moore, Amari Cooper, Calvin Ridley, Brian Thomas, Jamison Williams. 6 straight picks. So I already made my bed. Whether it's right, whether that's enough receiver firepower to get there, who knows? But the correlation and the structure is there. And we'll see how the players end up. Tight ends, I could go a little weak here, but personally, I don't mind 2 tight end builds with guys I like and their offenses like Fant and Jonnu. One of those guys has to probably be better than his ADP. Otherwise, I'm falling behind at tight end. But
I mentioned earlier that Cole Turner was my tight end too. On the I not only made the final, I got 12th in Best Ball Mania last year. My 14th round Sam Laporta and last round Cole Turner were my only 2 tight ends. And so I know that's Sam you need one of those guys to be.
Speaks to how little having the second tight end matters if the first tight end is good, right?
Cole Turner provided 1 week for me, and it was Sam Laporta's bye, and Cole Turner happened to be playing in that week, and he scored like 4 fantasy points or whatever. So I got
4 could be the difference between whether you get out of the pod or not. Really,
right, but you know what I mean? Like, I think as much as I love elite tight ends, I think that what you did here is like a sneaky, sharp way to play it. Just like, what if one of these later guys is Sam Laporta? What if I love to use, maybe I'm getting boomerish. I love to use Jordan Reed as like my example, like the late round tight end who is the tight end 1. And is like the guy we're drafting really high, everywhere for several years. Laporta is the tight end 1 now. But I think that Sam Laporta didn't wow people as much. It was just like he was really good for a rookie. Jordan Reed was like, oh my God, you lost everything if you didn't have Jordan Reed that year. Like you can get that. I'm not saying it's going to happen. That's not my bet. But when I don't have a tight end through, say, David Njoku or Brock Bowers, I think everyone's default is just, I got to take 3. I got to take 3. And I don't have a problem with taking 3, but I think you can like mix some too. Like I really like Jonnu and I really like Fant. And if they happen to hit the reason why we're taking them is because there's like real paths to them being smashes for fantasy. And they're probably pretty good football players. Well, if all that comes together, why do you need to have Juwan Johnson on that team? You don't necessarily. And I like to play, like I said, I'm biased because I had a team that was Sam Laporta and Cole Turner that did really well last year. But that's the perfect example of like, you don't need to hit the nuts at tight end. You just need a little bit of run good.
Yeah. And the flex rate on tight ends is basically 0 unless you're just like, I still don't understand. And I'm seeing more people talk about it with you take 2 tight ends in the first 6 rounds. You go Kincaid and you go Bowers. And I'm like, mathematically, it doesn't make sense. I think it can help you get out of your pod because it kind of shifts the tight end room. And if it causes the other 11 teams in your pod to kind of maybe panic a little bit and take bad tight end builds, then sure. But I think that what happens is when let's say you get out of that, you're now facing a bunch of teams that built better around both Kincaid and Brock Bowers. And if one of them has the well-timed Jonnu Smith or Noah Fant that fills in during that week, you now lose, even though you have the same tight end as them. It's basically, it becomes the Kincaid is nullified there. And you now are relying on that second tight end, which you spent around 7 pick on. And they're getting one that maybe is 3 points different in the week, and they spent around 14 pick on it. That's where it doesn't make sense for me when there's almost zero chance that the tight end hits the flex. In this format, you're much likely to have running backs coming out of nowhere, spot start running backs hitting the flex versus the tight ends later on in the season, especially. So I just want to throw that out there that I'm with you. I don't need Fant or Jonnu to finish top 8. If one finishes tight end 10 and one finishes tight end 13, cumulatively, I'm going to get like tight end 8 on the season. I'm good with it. That keeps up with the person that took Trey McBride if he's tight end 5. But the gap of what we spent is massive. And that's where the win is, because I should be getting another win elsewhere with how I structured the team.
And it's the perfect example of how different this game is too, where if you get that, right, they're both hits. Maybe they're not Sam Laporta of last year or Trey McBride of last year. You can still get there with this, what we like to call it, like layering. Like if you just happen to get the right weeks at the right times that no one can ever predict, right? Jonnu gets 18 in week 15. And Noah Fant gets 18 in week 16, and then we double back, and Jonnu does 18 in week 17.
You actually drafted the tight end 1.
Yeah, you drafted Travis Kelce, right? You drafted old school Travis Kelce, but you only spent 2 late round picks on it. And like obviously, no one is saying we can predict that, but planning around your players being bad at a position, I'm only starting one of them because I technically can start 2 of them, is really not something I subscribe to. And that's the tight end thing. But
the power of doing what you just said, the power of doing that 30 times or 50 times, all you need it to do is happen once with the right combination. And it doesn't have to be where you get 20 points per game over the playoff weeks. But if you just get 13, so if you just get a top 6 producer out of that, and the power there is the combination, because there's a reason Noah Fant is tight end 20. It's because you don't expect him to rip off 3 straight 15-point games, right? But if you compare him with enough exposure to where, and this is what you were kind of talking about earlier, is if you're going to say, hey, I'm going to roster 20% Noah Fant because I like him a lot, he becomes the anchor with a bunch of teams where you're pairing him with another tight end. The strength is the 2 tight end build part. The anchor is Noah Fant. The diversification is I'm picking 6 to 8 other tight ends alongside of Noah Fant to hope that happens. You need Fant to probably be part of that equation because you're very heavily exposed to it. But then pairing him with another guy, but betting that, hey, I'm already betting on Fant heavily based on my exposure. Maybe I'm not as high on Tyler Conklin or Colby Parkinson or Jelani Woods or whatever it is. But if I get one of those right, it's layered. You know what I mean? There's layered bets. But if you're right, that's how you end up with the team. I think a lot of times we deconstruct these teams that had success the year past. And I don't know about you, but do you remember where you were when you drafted your team that made the finals? Like, do you remember like where you were? Were you outside on the deck or were you laying in bed? Do you remember? Were you in front of the computer using the tool?
I mean, I drafted Cole Turner, so I definitely don't remember where I was. I probably was not in a very good headspace to be drafting, Cole Turner on. But no, it's so damn true. The only team I've ever remembered where I drafted that did well was I drafted a team that got 10th in Bestball Mania 2 with Peter Overzet, friend of all of us Bestball streamers. And I went on his show. We drafted a Bestball Mania team together, and we got 10th, the team 2 years ago. And the best part is everyone hated it. Everyone absolutely hated that team that we drafted. Like live on the show, we were doing kind of it was late in the off season, and we were doing some Galaxy Brain things. I mentioned Sony Michel earlier on this show while we were talking, and we took, I was like, I think we should take Sony Michel in the last round. He ended up being a smash. But all of that is to say exactly your point that combining like that kind of that team, everything we talked about here, and then like the team, like I said, the team that I had that did really well last year, I had Sam Laporta. And if you would have just said, you mentioned like I'm going to draft 20% Noah Fant. If you would have just said I'm going to draft 20% Sam Laporta, and I'm only going to draft him on 2 tight end teams, and I'm going to rotate him, I'm going to Tyler Conklin, Noah Fant, Jonnu Smith, whoever, Colby Parkinson, Tyler Higbee last year, whatever. I'm going to rotate all those guys around. Hunter Henry, Juwan Johnson would have been the perfect guy actually last year to pair him with. But if you cycled through all of them guess what would have happened? You would have probably found the right layering and the right combo to have with Sam Laporta. And now it's easy to say in hindsight, but also it was kind of easy to say in foresight with Sam Laporta. So like now, if you have that same conviction about a Noah Fant or something like that, don't handcuff your bet. Don't take insurance. You're playing blackjack. Don't take the insurance, dude.
Right.
Like you have an ace. Don't take insurance. Bet your Noah Fant. Take your double. Take double your money, and rotate your other. Just there's a 10 under there. Keep playing it. Eventually, there's going to be a 10 under there. I promise. There's a 10 under there. The layering effect is going to come in if that thing hits. That's kind of how I feel about, like, we're talking about it through the tight end landscape, but it's how I feel about like everything in best ball. Is the more that I cycle through all this stuff, I'm going to make my bets, right? We're using Noah Fant as this example. I'm going to make my 4, 5, 6 bets. We all have them. Whatever your favorite player is, whatever your favorite stack is, or whatever your structure, 0 running back, right? For me, I'm going to make that bet. My bet is 0 running back. So once I made that bet, let's cycle through all the stuff. Like I did it. Don't buy insurance now. Once you made that bet, you made that bet, man. Like, capitalize on that bet, right? Like, let's go win $1.5 million when that bet hits. Don't hedge against yourself. Like, make that bet and figure out the way to optimize your whole portfolio. That $500 that you're playing that we were talking about before, optimize for whatever your bet is. You love Lamar Jackson. All right, let's do it. Let's ride with Lamar, and then let's optimize what the portfolio should look like around Lamar Jackson, and figure out how I win $1.5 million when Lamar Jackson is the guy you need.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, if I was going to advise somebody that's just starting and they're like, I'm going to draft a shit ton of teams over the next 6 weeks, do a little research. There's a ton of articles out there about proper structure. Understand proper structure, then start leaning into the bets you make player-wise and where they fit into certain structures. This is a good question, and then we'll go over your team and we'll get you out of here. Scott, how do you decide whether to go 2 QBs versus 3? I mean, in this case, I got Brock Purdy past his ADP. I got Jared Goff past his ADP. The fact that I took both of them the same game meant I'm going to try to take a third QB, but generally when I'm not taking a quarterback until round 10, the math does say I should take 3 QBs. However, back to your point we just made, you could also argue, hey, if you get 2 quarterbacks past their ADP and it's not guys playing in the same game, sure, if you take a top 8, top 10 QB, you should stick to 2. You're making a very expensive bet on Joe Burrow, Dak Prescott, whatever it is. Like, stick with probably 2. But there's been some teams where I've gone, damn, I took my first QB 16. It's Trevor Lawrence. Then I end up with, and I do take some Trevor Lawrence 3 QB builds just because of where I got him, because I have multiple angles to correlate. That's where I'm looking to go 3 if I have them past ADP. But you could also argue, man, if you got great value on Trevor Lawrence and Jared Goff, don't take 3, right? You're buying insurance at that point.
Yeah.
So there's not a science. It's just understanding kind of where, that's why I don't look at quarterbacks usually until, like, I have some Josh Allen teams, I have some Jalen Hurts teams, but I feel like I can build a better completed team that fits the right structure and has the correlation when I am able to start picking off of the, okay, I'm having to make a big bet on Joe Burrow, on Dak Prescott, on Jaden Daniels. You know what I mean? Like, I'd rather fish there than if I take Josh Allen. Like, if I'm taking Josh Allen in round 4, the numbers say he should hit my lineup 13 times.
Yeah.
Why do I even need a second quarterback? Truthfully, You know what I mean? Like, I need one. It can't be the same buy as Josh Allen, but I also need to hope that, how many truthfully times is Bryce Young going to crack the top 12? Maybe 4 or 5 times during the year. And I better damn hope it's during those weeks where I need him when Josh Allen's not doing it. But to take 3 or to take Lamar and Mahomes, it just, you're immediately stepping on your own shoes at that point. So go through your team real quick, talk through the build, and we'll get you out of here.
Yeah. So actually a little bit unique for me. I did do the 2 quarterback, but kind of late-ish quarterbacks with Justin Herbert and Kirk Cousins as my only 2 quarterbacks. I am, we talked it through with the tight end stuff. I definitely am doing, I think it's easier to do when you draft in volume like we are. Like I'm going to draft legitimately like thousands of best ball teams. And so I am trying to accomplish that layering effect with quarterbacks and with tight ends. And just saying, now, if I got to the Bryce Young, there is a tier cutoff. It might be Herbert. It might be Cousins. I'm not sure exactly where I would draw that line in the sand. But there is a tier break where I would say, okay, I'm going to take 3, but I'm pushing my 2 quarterback builds probably more than the average person is, and just saying, all right, I bet on Ladd, I bet on Herbert. We're going to get the good Chargers season. So we went with 2 quarterbacks with Herbert and Cousins. Also, the goal was to get CJ Stroud on this team because at wide receiver, I started Garrett Wilson, Nico Collins, and Tank Dell with two Texans wide receivers, kept on the wide receiver train with T. Higgins and Ladd McConkey, and then wanted CJ Stroud, got sniped on CJ Stroud. And so we pivoted over to, I had taken Kyle Pitts already, and I went to one of my big edges why I'm really big on zero running back this year is just this wide receiver window from like round 7 to round 13, 12, 13 is the strongest it's ever been. We talked earlier about, the new drafters coming in and like you have to resist the temptation to take the running back, in round 2, 3, 4, 5 because of what is available to you later. And that's it. Like I have Aaron Jones, starting running back for the Minnesota Vikings, historically pretty darn good offense. James Conner, I understand he's old. Trust me, he's not my flavor of running back necessarily, but starting running back for the Arizona Cardinals. Brian Robinson, starting running back for the Washington Commanders, right? Devin Singletary, starting. Like you get the gist that I can build a running back room that I never could have built before and have 5 wide receivers and Kyle Pitts in my first 6 rounds. And so I had to sacrifice a little bit at quarterback, double back for some of my rookie loves. Love Marshawn Lloyd, love Ray Davis, took Khalil Herbert, who I think is the best running back. I'm not sure the Bears know it, but I think Khalil Herbert is the best running back in Chicago. And then we kind of talked about it earlier. Didn't take Zay Flowers in that 4th round spot for T. Higgins. I wanted to set up Joe Burrow. Obviously didn't get Joe Burrow, but came back for Isaiah Likely as a second tight end to kind of give me my Ravens exposure alongside the Texans, and then just took my 2 favorites, late round wide receivers in Bo Melton and Andre Yoshibas to kind of round out the team. Those are just like, not like there's a mini correlation. Bo Melton correlates with Aaron Jones, but mostly a little bit of my player takes there with those last couple guys.
Yeah, I like it. And it allowed you to take an extra running back in there. You were able to sneak in. You're still able to get 7 receivers, but you're able to sneak in a 7th running back because you went 2 QB and 2 tight ends. Yep. So I like the build. I think it's got structure to it. It's got stacks with both your quarterbacks. I mean, that's a huge thing to, even if you don't have I think we oftentimes overrate the bring back a little bit. In terms of people go, oh man, I have Justin Herbert and Ladd McConkey. I need to get at least 3 Patriots on this team. Yep. And it's like, if the Patriots are bad and they're shitty before week 17, then the team's dead. It never even gets there. You know what I mean? And I've seen that where people will go, man, I'm really leaning into that Giants Colts stack because I went Michael Pittman and Anthony Richardson, So I got to make sure I get 3 Giants or 2 Giants. And I'm like, yeah, but the Giants suck. I just getting Darius Slayton.
What if the Colts score 40 and the Giants score 7?
I mean, I get it because you're already kind of betting that. Like we don't look at these teams and think, oh man, I really got to make sure I get my team there. I'm assuming that 85% of my teams are going to be dead by the time we get to the playoffs. Like that's going to. So I understand why you do it, but I do find it sometimes interesting when people will pick like 2 games. And they go, okay, I went heavy CJ Stroud, Tank Dell, Nico Collins. And then I have to get like 2 shitty Ravens because there's no Ravens left. So I got to get like Tez Walker and Nelson Aguilar. You know what I mean? It's like, yeah, but what if, first of all, those guys are probably eating each other during the season at some point.
Right.
Like you probably don't want both, but you're drafting them for this correlation and you do get tricked up with Spike Week, man. You see those colors light up and you're like, ooh, that's a better pick than there. And sometimes you got to zoom out and go, yeah, but probably Nelson Aguilar is not a better pick than like Luke McCaffrey. Like one actually has some upside and one doesn't. So you can get tricked into just over correlating teams, but that's why I've done a lot of like the ones that I did here where I don't need 3 games in week 16 or 17 where I have 5 players from those games. I have like little pockets of correlation with like 5 or 6 different games. And like you said, Bo Melton versus Aaron Jones, the odds that really matters or separates itself is pretty low. And there's probably going to be other teams that also then have Jordan Love and TJ Hawkinson, right? So you're not really getting an edge by doing that way, but at least you play a little bit of defense with correlation when you get to the finals if your team makes the finals. So good stuff. I want to have you back like in the off season where there's not like all this ADP to talk through. Because something that Ray and I have talked about a ton is, and maybe I'll leave this as a cliffhanger. You don't have to answer it because it could literally be like a 15-minute question. I want to have you on in the off season and just talk about, are we getting to a world very soon? And this affects you because you've made Spike Week. Are we getting to a world where because of the number of constraints with Bestball and efficiencies that we've seen grow over the last couple of years, are we getting to a point where a lot of this structure stuff and correlation stuff is almost going to be solved / dummy proof here very soon? And then you now have to go back to some of the things we talked about, like multi-layering macro strategies versus micro player take strategies to probably take it to the next level. Because, Eric, what if you get in a draft and it's I'm sure because you have your own community. You're drafting against 11 other Spike Weekers.
Yep.
That's good because everybody's team's going to be, you're not going to step on each other's toes that much, right? But let's assume that everybody, like 50% of people in Underdog were using the tool. Now you're going like, is the tool that big of an edge anymore? Because everybody's following it. I don't know. I know you probably think about that kind of stuff. You don't have to answer it, but something that I want to have you back on and talk about if you have any like real brief thoughts.
Yeah, let's chop it up in the off season. As you mentioned, those are the things that I think a lot about. Obviously, starting a company, putting my whole life on the line around all of this stuff. But I think there's an interesting kind of dissection between the game of Bestball, like the nuances of the specific game of Bestball, and how solved can it be, and how helpful are tools actually, and all that kind of stuff. We try to, like I said, create tools that help you as a drafter make better decisions based upon the things that you think are important. If the things that you think are important are not right, you're probably going to build worse teams more easily. You know what I mean? So correct. It's kind of like, I don't know if anybody listening or if you played DFS, it's kind of like a DFS optimizer. You can create 150. Anybody on the planet now can create 150 teams in DFS, in a couple seconds, right? Click a button, it creates 150 teams. But if what you're putting into the optimizer is just it's like an Excel spreadsheet, right? It's not really doing anything profound. It's just taking your thoughts and spitting out what you think should be the right way to play that week 1 NFL slate. It's kind of how Bestball works, in that you tell me how this season is going to play. Like I would love to have the answers. I wish I did. We probably wouldn't be here if I had all the answers, because I wouldn't talk to you.
We're playing a game that has enough variance in it that you can't solve for it, right? Like the thought that I could solve an NFL season. Like I asked somebody the other day that was doing their projections. I said, what would be really cool is if you could do projections week to week. And immediately you get to like week 2 and you go, I don't know how what to project. You know what I mean? Because it depends on what happened before it.
I tried to, it's so funny you say that, because last year I did some, and it was much more of a good exercise for me than maybe for the customers, but I tried to put together some projections of like weekly, season long, like total median projection for every single player, but then also do like some contingent value projections, meaning like, okay, so this year, as an example, let's say Deebo Samuel gets hurt. What does that mean? Ricky Pearsall projected for 2 points before Deebo Samuel was out, but when Deebo Samuel is out, what does Ricky Pearsall look like now? Because that, all of that stuff is like actually the most important part is like of best ball, is not just like, what do we think week 1 is going to look like? It's how the heck is this total chaotic NFL season going to play out? Like, no one saw Kyren Williams coming. No one saw. We could say like he was a good pick for sure. Like I think he was a good pick by the end of the season. But he was the running back 2 in fantasy. Nobody saw that coming. Nobody saw the Puka season coming. Nobody saw the Tank Dell season coming. Nobody saw J.K. Dobbins tearing his Achilles in the first half of week 1. All of that is like what simultaneously makes this game fun and makes this game tilting, but also makes this game like kind of unsolvable, because it's not a 1 week or a 1 game or a 1 day type of situation. It is a 17-week marathon of chaos, right? Like, you cannot possibly know what's going to happen in week 17. I talked to, you mentioned, I went on JJ Zacharyason's show, and he asked about like strength of schedule and like week 17 matchups. And I was like, remember last year, Browns Jets was like the grossest week 17 game you could ever imagine. It was what we all thought were like maybe the 2 best defenses in all of the NFL. And even though
Thursday night game,
a Thursday night short week in
December in Cleveland, which everybody would have been like, that's one to never stack or correlate.
It's negative degree on a short week in Cleveland, like the week of Christmas, where like, this is you can like, I'm sure there were, not to throw shade, I'm sure there were people saying you can't take those guys because the week 17 game is really bad. And the next thing you know, there was multiple guys you really, really wanted from that game, namely Breece Hall, even though they lost and didn't score that many points. We're just so bad at projecting that kind of stuff. And that's the perfect example of this game is so chaotic that's what's great. That's why I love it. That's why we built Spike Week. That's why I'm excited to come on shows like this with you to talk about it, because anybody can sit here and pretend they have all the answers, and no one does. But we can try to make the best decisions possible every single year, and the best decisions like in a draft, like we just did, that once I took X player, what's the right 5th round pick? What's the right 18th round pick to take with my 1st round pick? That I think is not solvable, but is we can optimize for it within our own portfolios. And I think that's what makes this game just the absolute best. So I just went on for 15 minutes when you said, I think this is going to be a 15 minute.
No, you're good. I asked you a leading question and said, here, sum it up in the 60 seconds. It's something that clearly you're passionate.
I'm passionate.
Your lifeblood is built about it. So I understand why it would be an entire
show. But
yes,
I would love to chop it up, maybe in the off season.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, we have, so we're huge into Dynasty, and we've been trying to kind of solve for, Dynasty just makes it adds in a whole nother layer of the shit that's unpredictable and variant, meaning like you have multiple years of stuff you have to factor in. You have draft pick values, all that kind of stuff. But one thing we've played with is we have a war tool that essentially goes through and it literally gives you a roadmap of how to roster construct. And now you have the Dynasty aspect into it as well.
Yeah.
But it's hilarious when you look back at a snapshot. We use a 3-year rolling average as like kind of the guide to how to roster construct, depending on your scoring format, roster size, all that kind of stuff. But it's hilarious. You look at the graph and you look at the distribution for 3 years. Then you look at one individual year compared to that graph and you go, okay, it's a little different in 2022 versus 2023. But then you show people like 1 week samples of the graph and they're like, holy shit, that doesn't even look like the same. You'll have 8 tight ends up here and you're going, wow, the tight ends hit the flex at way above replacement level. The running backs were shitty this week. And you go, how the hell does that 1 week end up with this big graph for a season. And that's literally the part that you cannot solve for. The individual weeks, the distribution and combination of players going, okay, you don't know if, like, it's just sheer luck. If what you talked about earlier, you two tight ends have their top 12 weeks on different times when other players that you've faded didn't have a good week, like it's luck. There's no way to ever solve for that. That's what keeps this game fun. Even though we have the same format, the same construction, all that stuff is largely known, but there's so much that you can't solve for. So yeah, we'll come back off season and talk about this. I appreciate you, man.
Absolutely. A ton of fun. And I will just say that I do think, even though I'm kind of waxing poetic about the chaos and the variance of it, you can put yourself, if you listen to Scott and you listen to all of the content of the folks who are really grinding this kind of stuff, you can put yourself in the position to most benefit from when the things play out in a certain way. And I think that when you listen to folks like here, that's what everybody's goal is like, I don't know who's going to score the most points in week 17. I don't know who's going to score the most points over the whole season. I don't know that Jonnu and Noah Fant are going to perfectly come together with all of their scores. No one does, but I would like to build a bunch of teams that set me up to benefit from the total chaos in the best way possible. And I think we built the tools to help with that. I think you guys are definitely doing that here with all of your content. And you mentioned the dynasty tools. You're definitely doing that. So I think that you can gain it's simultaneously the game that is the most high variance and the most chaotic, but also the game you can gain the most edge if you just do some really, really simple and small things. So that's I'm biased. That's why I love it. But it's this weird intersection, right? Of like, I know that it's high variance, but I also know that there's a ton of edges to be had if you can, implement 4, 5, 6 different things really well and better than your opponents.
100%. Spikeweek.com. You can find the tool over there. We really didn't show much of it here because we were looking at the board, but there's a lot of things you can do after the fact to analyze what you've already drafted. You can work with multiple platforms. I have quite a few on DraftKings. DraftKings is an own animal on itself. I like to go to DraftKings for, I know this is an Underdog sponsored show, but I like to go to DraftKings maybe for a weekend and just play over there, just get in a room with people that you can tell the ones that have been drafting on other sites versus on DraftKings. You go, wow, yeah, that's interesting. But yeah, syncs with multiple sites. You can look at your combinations. You can look at your exposure. I mean, you can do a bunch of different things that we didn't show on here. So spikeweek.com, follow him at Eric Beimfohr on Twitter. And Eric, thank you for coming on. It was a blast. We'll have you back on the off season to talk more theory behind this stuff when we're not working on a live board. So thank you. And we'll sign off for the week. Be chill, everyone.